Hello, and welcome to this higher English video focusing on RUAE and specifically looking at the analysis of sentence structure. So a quick reminder then of how analysis questions might be written in an RUAE paper. They're either going to specify one or more techniques. So for example, how does the writer's use of word choice and sentence structure show something? Or they may be a more open, general question allowing you to comment on any techniques that you can identify. For instance, how does the writer's use of language show something? So they'll either specify a technique or it'll be open to any feature of language. And if it specifies sentence structure or if it just says language, then that means you can talk about sentence structure. So when you're looking at sentence structure, there's an awful lot of different things you could talk about. If you're looking for a reminder, a little mnemonic device to help you remember what are the main aspects of a sentence you might want to look at, you could use this one. Little people will triumph, which means you're going to look at length, punctuation, word order, and type. So is the sentence particularly long or particularly short? Is there any interesting punctuation? Semicolons, colons, exclamation marks, ellipses, that kind of thing. Is the word order interesting? Have they taken a straightforward sentence like I stand here and inverted the word order, made it here I stand to make it more defiant? Or is the type of sentence we're talking about? Are we talking questions, lists, statements, exclamations, that kind of thing? So those are your general principles, but I'm now going to show you some more specific examples. So here are the usual suspects when it comes to sentence structure. If you are confident that you can talk about these 5 aspects of sentence structure, you will always be fine for your higher RUAE papers. If a question is asking you about sentence structure, then one or more of these features will be present. And so as long as you can identify them and analyze them and say something intelligent about them, you will get the marks. So those 5 features are lists, parenthesis, short or minor sentences, questions, and parallel structure, which is often also referred to as anaphora. So I'll go through each of these and explain how they work. So let's start with lists. Lists are far and away the most common aspect of sentence structure to identify in an RUAE paper. So if you only learn one thing from this video, make sure you learn how to properly analyze lists. Now lists are always used to emphasize scale and or variety. Okay, that's the golden rule when it comes to lists. If you're going to get the mark, you need to clearly say what that list is emphasizing, and it must relate to scale and or variety. So that means in your answer, you're looking to use words and phrases such as how much, how many, all the different, as well as actually using the words scale and variety as well. But what is really important is you must be specific. What specifically is a list that you are commenting on emphasizing? You can't just quote a list and say this list emphasizes the scale of variety. They're not going to give you a mark for that. That's a generic comment. You need to look at that list and see the scale or variety of what is being emphasized. So here is an example of a list from an article. Now, if you want, you can scan the QR code and you can read the entire article that this has come from. So the extract says, Williams is extremely chary of talking about what is currently the hot button issue of acting: sexism, sexist pay scales, sexual harassment, sexist bullying, the lot. Okay, so there's a clear list there. What we need to think about is what is being emphasized by that list. And here you can see a basic comment analyzing that list. The list emphasizes all of the topics she won't talk about. You could also say the list emphasizes how many topics she won't talk about. The list emphasizes the scale of the topics that she won't talk about, that kind of thing. Okay, now you'll note I've said this is a basic comment. This would be enough to get you 1 mark. There's not really enough in that list for you to analyze it to get a detailed or insightful comment, which would be worth 2 marks at higher. And indeed, that's a good rule of thumb. It is very rare that a list is going to have enough in it as a list to allow you to get a detailed and insightful comment. What I will say though is it's worth remembering sentences are made up of words, and if you're analyzing a list and there are words within that list that you could also analyze as word choice, then you should absolutely do that as well. And you can definitely get credit for analyzing the words within a list and then separately saying that by organizing those words in a list, it emphasizes the scale and variety that you're talking about. So on to parenthesis, which you may have heard as the term brackets is the other kind of name for that. Now parentheses can be marked with brackets, but they can also be used in English by using dashes or indeed by using commas. And this is the sort of one of those rare places where commas are perhaps we're talking about not as commas but as parentheses. Now The way we use them as writers, and we use them all the time, is we use them to add in an aside or an explanation or additional information. But you're not going to get credit for saying that. That is the functional syntactic use of parenthesis. What we're analysing in RUAE is the stylistic impact. What is the effect of that? They haven't just randomly decided to put an aside in there or put some extra information in there. The writer has chosen to put those words in parenthesis for a reason, and you need to identify what that is. And generally speaking, it tends to be used for emphasis. Okay, by putting a phrase in parenthesis, and this is particularly the case if you use dashes, but it does also apply to brackets and commas, it makes it stand out from the words around it, which means it adds a greater impact. So perhaps the writer has used parenthesis to emphasize something, to add impact to something. Of course, sometimes the effect is designed to be ironic, or sometimes the aside is used to create a conversational tone, or to suggest understatement, to take an important point, put it in parenthesis, thus implying it's actually less important than it is. So here's another example of parenthesis, and once again, if you want, you can scan the QR code there if you want to read the full article. This is an article about politics and the left wing and the right wing from The Guardian. So the sentence reads, in fact, Conservative MPs are actually much further to the right of their voters and the country on economic matters. So there we can see the parenthetical aside there and the country in between those dashes. Now, a basic comment you could get on parenthesis would be something like this. The parenthesis emphasises the Conservative views are more right-wing than most people in Britain, and that would get you a mark. Okay? And again, often in an analysis question, the best strategy is to look at how many marks are available and make that many basic comments. So if it's worth 4 marks, you make 4 basic comments and you'll get your 4 marks. However, this is one of those instances where actually it is possible to make a detailed and insightful comment about this particular use of parenthesis. Okay, the parenthesis emphasises the fact that Conservatives' views are not only further to right than those of their voters, but also those of the country as a whole. This reinforces how shockingly out of touch their views are in relation to public opinion. Okay, so we're adding a little bit of extra detail and insight into why and how that parenthesis has been used by the writer. They've chosen to add that information in, they've put it in parenthesis to make it stand out, to add impact, and it's important that that stands out and has impact because it emphasises the point they're trying to make about these economic views being extremely right-wing. So here I've grouped together 2 different types of sentence that are very similar: short sentences and minor sentences. Short sentences, the key thing here is that they must actually be short. That generally speaking means 5 words or fewer. Short sentences could be as short as only 1 or 2 words. It is possible for them to be slightly longer than 5 words if and only if all the other sentences surrounding there are significantly longer, at which point that sentence becomes short comparatively. But generally speaking, you're looking at 5 words or fewer for it to count as a short sentence. And writers use short sentences for emphasis again, to add impact to the ideas or words contained inside that sentence. Now, a minor sentence is a type of short sentence. It's a sentence without a verb. Generally speaking, sentences always need both a verb and a subject. However, although this is technically not grammatical, it is something that writers do quite often, is include these minor sentences that lack a verb because they are authentic, and in particular, we use them all the time in conversation. So little exclamations like no, or absolute nonsense, or yeah, right, or as if, all those little fragments that don't have verbs are what we would call minor sentences. Now, they can be used in the same way as short sentences to add impact, to add emphasis to the ideas that are in there. Particularly something like no or absolute nonsense is clearly emphatic, is clearly emphasizing the strength of feeling that they're conveying there. But also minor sentences contribute to tone in a piece of writing, and they can make a piece of writing sound more conversational or more informal because we often talk in minor sentences, but also it can add to an incredulous tone, a tone of sort of disbelief or feeling stunned. Because it's almost as if the writer is unable to write a fully articulate sentence because they're so shocked and appalled. So here's an example of a short sentence. Once again, you can scan the QR code if you want to read the whole article. This one is taken from the website The Conversation, and it's an article about net zero and carbon emissions. So you have that first paragraph where it talks about the loose nature of some of the pledges that countries are making about climate change, and then it quotes Greta Thunberg, who says that they're being used as excuses to postpone real action. We then get our short sentence: this is a real danger. If we allow disingenuous use of net zero to discredit the concept as a whole, we risk giving up the hard-won gains secured by activists and vulnerable countries in Paris in 2015. So there in red, you can see the short sentence, "This is a real danger." And this short sentence emphasises the risks of delaying genuine action, adding impact to show how important this is. Okay, now that's a basic comment. Again, there's not enough there to get a detailed, insightful comment, and there very rarely will be in a short or minor sentence. But you can see here, they want to emphasize the fact that it's a danger. They put it in a short sentence. It adds that impact, it adds that emphasis, and makes it clear just how dangerous it really is. So on to questions, and as I say at the start there, we know what questions are, right? And if you don't know what a question is, you do now. It's one of those marked out by question mark. Now, questions can be used in lots of different ways by writers. They can be used to invite the reader to consider the questions, to think about their own response, which then makes them a bit more engaged in the article, okay, because they are mentally answering the question that the writer has asked them. They can also be used to convey doubt or confusion, especially if there are several questions in a row, that might suggest somebody's feeling anxious or overwhelmed or uncertain about something. But again, as is the case with all of these, really, you need to be specific about the specific questions that you're analysing, okay? If they are inviting the reader to think about something, what specifically is the reader being invited to think about? If they're being used to show doubt or confusion, what specifically is the writer anxious about or confused by? Okay, it's not enough to just say it shows doubt or it makes the reader think. That's too vague. You need to be specific. Think about what. Doubt about what. So here's an example of questions and how they could be used in an article. And again, there's a QR code you can scan there if you want to read the full article. This is from an article about a village that's been overwhelmed by the smell from kind of landfill, and it's actually having like negative health impacts on people there. My daughter woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning with nosebleeds, and that's scary. You worry what you're putting your children through. Should I take her away? What's going to happen to us in years to come? Are we going to be ill? So here we can see in red where the questions are. Should I take her away? What's going to happen to us in years to come? Are we going to be ill? And we need to think about what's being shown by these questions. What's the effect of those on the reader? And as I say here, the questions, for a basic comment, the questions emphasise how concerned she is about what's going to happen. That's enough to get you a mark. I would say it is possible to give a detailed and insightful comment looking at these, though. As it says there, the questions highlight the woman's concern for her daughter and her own well-being. By listing a series of questions, a panicked, flustered tone is created, conveying just how worried she is and how fearful this situation has made her. Now, the reason this comment is detailed and insightful is because it goes beyond just the simple kind of questions emphasising a sense of concern about what's going to happen, but it looks at them in a few different ways. It mentions listing a series of questions, you know, suggesting that we understand that this is an emphatic thing that's building up with several questions in a row, but it also then looks at the tone of what's being written there, a panicked, flustered tone, and that conveys just how worried she is and how fearful the situation has made her. So by thinking about all these things, the fact that it's questions, the fact it's a series of questions listed, the fact that then is contributing to a particular tone in the writing, we really develop that and tease that out to get a detailed and insightful comment that might get you 2 marks in an exam situation. But as I say, generally speaking, strategically, the best bet is to assume that you're only going to get 1 mark for these things and put out 1 comment per mark that's available. But if you wanted to, this is an example of what a detailed and insightful comment might look like. And last but not least, we have parallel structure, which is also sometimes referred to as anaphora. Now, parallel structure or anaphora is when a writer repeats the same words or phrases in successive clauses or sentences. And again, as is often the case with sentence structure, this is done to emphasize something specific, a particular word or an idea or an attitude, or to create a particular tone. And often, indeed I would say almost always, the repeated word or phrase is either going to be the beginning or the end of the sentence or clause. So it's either going to be a series of sentences or clauses that start the same way, or a series of sentences or clauses that end the same way. Now, parallel structure or anaphora is a very common technique. You will definitely have encountered it in your life. In particular, it is a technique that is favoured with public speaking in speeches. And the most famous example of this is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech from his March on Washington. I'm assuming everybody watching this video is already familiar with the speech. It is very, very famous, but if not, there's a couple of QR codes there, so you can either watch it on YouTube or you can read the full text from the Huffington Post. So here we've got an extract from the I Have a Dream speech. I'm not going to read it all out, but you can see I've highlighted in red there that all of these sentences are beginning with the phrase, I have a dream. Okay, and our comment on this structure is that the parallel structure repeating I have a dream emphasizes how much he hopes for these things to come to pass, creating an optimistic, aspirational tone. Okay, and that's the effect that you're going to get from analysing the parallel structure. Okay, there's always going to be an idea or a tone or something that's being emphasised by repeating that. And by saying, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, it emphasises how much he's hoping this. And it builds up this sense of anticipation and optimism for what's going to come in the future. So, having talked you through the usual suspects, the 5 main types of sentence structure, now is going to be a brief opportunity for you to put this into practice yourself. I'm going to give you some other examples of extracts from different pieces of writing. I'm going to recommend that you'll see a little stop sign will pop up. I'm going to recommend you pause the video, have a think yourself, see if you can come up with your own kind of understanding of what's going on in that little extract, and then I'll talk you through 1 or 2 of the things that I've noticed about sentence structure in there. So here's the first example from a book called The Art of Fiction by David Lodge, which I highly recommend to anybody that's interested in studying English kind of beyond higher, into advanced higher, or maybe university. He looks at lots of different genres of fiction and how it's done. And this is from the chapter on suspense. Novels are narratives. A narrative, whatever its medium, words, film, strip, cartoon, holds the interest of an audience by raising questions in their minds and delaying the answers. So, in a moment, I'm going to talk you through some aspects of sentence structure you might want to comment on here. What you might want to do is just pause the video and have a think yourself, see if you can identify anything in there that's worth talking about from the perspective of sentence structure. When you're ready, you can then carry on with the video and see what I came up with. So there you'll see the most obvious thing that kind of should leap out from this at you is we have a list. It's a list of 3 words, film, strip, cartoon, and that list is also presented in the form of parenthesis as well. And indeed, generally speaking, we would call that a parenthetical list because it's a list that is also parenthesis. And of course, what that list is doing is it is emphasizing all of the different types of story that feature suspense. Okay, words, i.e. novels, film, i.e. cinema, and strip cartoons, so like cartoons or comics or graphic novels, that kind of thing. All those different media all contain stories that rely on suspense. So that list, that parenthetical list, is emphasizing all those different types. Now you will notice there's 2 different features there. There's parentheses and there's lists, but to be honest, the point we're making there is quite basic. So even though we've identified 2 features, it's both parenthesis and a list, you're not going to get 2 marks for that. That's only going to count as a basic comment because really what you're saying is quite straightforward. But that's not the only aspect of sentence structure I would talk about. Now I've called this extra credit because it doesn't really fit into the usual suspects we've been talking about, but I think it's worth noting because I'm sure some of you watching this video will have thought about this yourself. If we look at that final clause, and delaying the answers, what's interesting there is we have quite a long sentence here with that delayed final clause. There's multiple subordinate clauses within the sentence. We've got a parenthesis in the middle as well. And of course, what that does, this sentence is actually mimicking the suspense that he's describing by building up to the word answers at the very end, just as in these stories he's describing, the narrative builds up to a revelation at the end where we find out the answer, we find out what's lying behind the suspense. So what you've got here is you've got an example of the form of this sentence mimicking the idea of the sentence. He's talking about suspense novels and suspense films and how they raise questions and questions and they delay and delay, and only at the end, at the climax, do they tell you what's going on. And this sentence does the same thing. It delays and delays, and at the very end it gets to the word the answers, so we don't get the answers until the end of the sentence. Okay, now if you didn't notice that, that's okay. That's a slightly more subtle point, but if you did, that's an example of something you could comment on in sentence structure that doesn't neatly fall into any one of these kind of techniques, but is you understanding that there is an art to how a writer puts together words and that you can maybe comment on that. Now here we've got another example for you to have a look at and a think about, and then you can pause the video, see what kind of sentences you can kind of pick up from this, and then I'll go on to kind of talk through what I think about them. This is from a book called A Dream About Lightning Bugs by Ben Folds. Ben Folds is a musician and a songwriter, and A Dream About Lightning Bugs is his memoir, his autobiography. And in this chapter particularly, he's talking about how he sees his songwriting process, and he sees it almost as if he doesn't create the melodies already exist in the world, and he as a songwriter notices them, and his job is to notice them in the world and then package them into a song so that everybody else can hear it. And that's what he's sort of trying to suggest, that songs are around us all the time. So pause the video, have a look at this, think about what different techniques are coming up, and when you're ready, play the video again and I will talk you through some sentence structure. So here's the first thing I would comment on this. Right at the beginning, we've got a series of short and minor sentences. Here you go, a melody, see, I found it. Now you could just quote one of these and kind of make a comment about it. That would be fine. What you couldn't do would be quote each of these separately and try and make a basic comment about each one, because they're all kind of doing the same thing. So really you would quote one of them or you quote all four of them and talk about the cumulative effect there. Because of course what these sentences are is they are short, they are direct, they are simple, and what they are emphasizing is the simplicity of finding a melody. He's trying to tell you that it's not something hard, it's not something abstract, it's not something impossible, it's something that certainly to him, and arguably to all of us, is actually quite straightforward. If we just relax, if we just listen to the world around us, we will hear these melodies. So the simplicity of the sentences that are short, direct, and simple are reflecting the simplicity of the process of creating a melody. The second feature that I think is worth talking about is the list. The rhythm of the washing machine, the awkward pause in a conversation, or the random collision of two radio stations blasting from two different cars, and how it reminded you of your parents trying to be heard over one another. So you've got a long list there emphasizing how many different sources of inspiration that he can kind of describe, or that we might find to find a melody. There's lots of very different scenarios there. They're all very normal, they're all very mundane, they're all the kind of thing we might happen, right? We all might hear a washing machine and having that kind of unique rhythm. We all might have a conversation and there's like a slightly odd pause in between different people speaking, or the idea of sounds coming from different cars that pass you and that reminding you of your parents kind of talking over one another or maybe arguing, and all of these different very mundane, very normal, very recognizable experiences that we can all relate to. They're all sources of inspiration. So by listing them like that, by putting them one after the other in a list, it's emphasizing just how many different sources of inspiration there are for us to hear melodies in the world around us. And here's the final thing that I think is worth talking about inside this extract, which is the questions at the end. What do you notice that glows beneath the silence? Can that be bottled or framed? And of course, what he's doing there with those questions is he is involving the reader in the process. He's inviting us to consider our own sources of inspiration, where we might find a melody in ourselves. Okay, so remember, questions might be looking at doubt or confusion or uncertainty, like that earlier example I gave you, but this example of questions are actually directly inviting you as a reader to actually think about what he's describing and have a go yourself. What do you notice that glows beneath the silence? Can that be bottled? Can that be framed? Can you hear a melody in the world around you and turn that into a song or some other piece of art? So there you go, that's my overview of the usual suspects of sentence structure. Next steps, if you want to practice this further, obviously you can use textbooks and you can go use past papers, but actually all you need to do is find yourself good articles that you can kind of read through, identify language features and analyse them. There's also videos there on analysing word choice and on analysing imagery, as well as an overview of those own words questions where you kind of paraphrase and summarise using your own words. So you can practice all of those skills together by reading a good quality article, the type of article you're going to get in an RUAE assessment, and practicing those skills. So pick a paragraph and summarise the main ideas using your own words. Pick another paragraph and identify language features and then comment on the effect of those language features and what they're doing. And if you're struggling to find good articles to read, remember earlier in the video I shared QR codes that you could scan to read the articles where I got those examples from. So do feel free to go back to the start of the video and scan those QR codes, and those will give you perfectly good articles that you can read through and analyse and annotate. Remember, the key thing with RUAE is practicing all the time, being alert to uses of language around you, identifying that it's a list or that it's a question or that it's a minor sentence, thinking about why the writer's written it that way, thinking about what the effect of that is. And as long as you're practicing those skills, you are getting better at RUAE. So there you go, that's our video on sentence structure. I hope you found it useful. Do remember there are videos on other aspects of RUAE, as well as our guided analysis video that takes you through a full article talking about both how one might look at it for own words questions, as well as analysing some of the language that's inside there.